During the Middle Ages, there were three patron saints of Ireland, not just like now where we think of St. Patrick as the patron. In the Middle Ages, both St. Bridget and St. Cholmcille were patrons as well. St. Cholmcille, of course, is his name in Irish, and St. Columba, his name in Latin or in English as well now. Since Cholmcille died on what was almost certainly the 9th of June in the year 593, people have been, as it were, adding to his story, inventing new stories about him, developing existing stories, and making pieces of art that expand, if you like, the ideas about him. And scholars have been working on him as well, especially in modern times. It's fair to say the scholars all over the world are working on or writing about Cholmcille, doing PhDs, writing books and articles, etc. And that's literally from Tori to Tokyo, or from Moscow to Maharorty and on to Milwaukee. And I suppose you could say that a bit like James Joyce and W.B. Yeats, the literary industries associated with those two characters, there is a literary industry, a Cholmcille industry. Now, while there's great respect, therefore, in many parts of the world to Cholmcille, we have to understand that not everyone has the same, if you like, idea about what the word saint means or what it represents. But whether you accept the word saint as a religious title or not, nevertheless, irrespective of that, Cholmcille still stands out as one of the most significant figures in these islands, Britain and Ireland, of the 6th century. We have many kind of images or characterizations of the saint. I suppose at least there are three. We could divide those into three. There's number one, there's Cholmcille in the hagiography, the holy man, the saint, and the person of the legends. Number two, there's Cholmcille of the folklore and songs, in which he often turns out to be a kind of a trickster. And then there's what we might think of as Cholmcille, the historical figure, the genuine, real person that lived in the 6th century. Now, very often there are huge differences between what we can know and say about that historical figure and the kind of fictional character that appears to us in the stories and in the arts, objects and things like that. The historical figure lived, that is, the real Cholmcille, the real Columba, lived for the last 3/4 of the 6th century. Now, when Christianity came to Ireland, at the same time it brought with it literacy, reading and writing. And because history is based on written sources, written documents, that meant that history came at the same time. So those three things came together to Ireland at the same time: Christianity, literacy, and history. And for the most part, the early history of both Ireland and Scotland derives from the annals, what we call the annals. And these were developed, written down for the first time at Cholmcille's monastery on Iona. And maybe the saint himself took part in that process. So in that sense, we can say that the monks of Iona, and maybe Cholmcille himself, are responsible for the beginning of the history, the written history of Ireland. And just to add to that, there are many other firsts and beginnings of things from Iona, in matters of religion, in matters of art, in matters of even politics. Now, until recently, we used to think that Cholmcille was born in the year 521, that he emigrated to Scotland in 563 and he died in 597. But after considerable and detailed study of the annals by Dr. Dan McCarthy from Trinity College in Dublin, those dates have been slightly altered, only slightly. And now we think Cholmcille was born in the year 520, that he went to Scotland in 562, and that he died in 593. Now, in the tradition, and I have to emphasise that because we've no historical records to prove it, his birth occurred on the 7th of December And that means, therefore, that on the 7th of December this year, 2020, it will be 1,500 years since the birth of St. Cholmcille. Now, as sources for his own life and for the, I suppose more particularly for the growth of the cult of the saint, we have three medieval lives, hagiographical lives, following a particular Christian pattern. Anyway, these lives, we have three of these written about St. Columba in Cholmcille. The first, the oldest, is the Vita Columbae, that was written by Adamnan, who is the ninth abbot of Iona, in Latin on Iona, and it was written about 100 years after Columbkille's death. That is, roughly speaking, around the year 700 or thereabouts. The second life is in Irish, in Middle Irish, written in Derry. Unfortunately, we don't have the name of the person who wrote it, and it was written round about the year 1150. And the third life of the saint that we have, also written in Irish and very important for Irish, is a major work written, or I think it's better to use the word composed, by Manus O'Donnell in around about the year 1532. Now, within a few years of writing or composing that work, Manus would become Taoiseach or Tierna or Lord of Donegal. The work he wrote about, or he composed about Columbkille, is really a major document, and it's very important in the history of the literature of the Irish language. It's effectively an encyclopedia of Columbkille because it brings together all the stories and all the traditions about the saint that were known about 1,000 years after his death. Now, we have to caution that very little of it is based on historical sources, and for the most part it's a book of legends and folk tales. Now, there's an awful lot of exaggeration and propaganda about Columbkille, but we can say with absolute certainty that it came from a dynasty, a family, a royal family from County Donegal that we call the Cineal Connell, who of course give their name to Tír Connell. And they were an extraordinarily powerful and great noble family. Their headquarters was almost certainly a hill just outside Lifford called Chrochan or Crochan, and it is situated in what is really still some of the best agricultural land in Ireland, the rich agricultural land of East Donegal. Many people don't associate good land with Donegal, but East Donegal is very, very rich land. And we can say almost certainly that it was there on Crochan, or certainly close to it, that his father, Columbkille's father, Phelim, lived or came from. Now, his mother's name was Ethna, and we have to be a little bit cautious about that because Ethna was also the name of a great territorial goddess in ancient times. But at any rate, there are many stories about Columbkille's mother, where she came from, what part of Ireland. There are several places in Ireland that claim her. But the one that is most trustworthy, in my opinion anyway, is that she came from a little kingdom called the Corbrega, and they were based on the Fanad Peninsula in North Donegal. Now, Fanad is very close to Gartan, where Columbkille is supposed to be born, and I think it's very reasonable, to think that that's where his mother probably came from. Now, we know there are other stories about kind of heroes from Donegal that tell us that when it came for the time of their birth, when they were about to be born, their mothers went to their own homes, back to their own parents' home, and gave birth to the child there. In other words, they didn't. The mothers did not stay in the homes of their husbands, but they went back to their own home place, and all of that kind of tends to support the idea that Ethna came from roughly Fanad, and that Gartan was the birthplace of the saint. Now, according to the lives, especially the lives written in Irish, um, Derry was the first monastery founded by Columba and the one that he, if you like, most loved afterwards. But the written evidence doesn't support that, the historical evidence. It says, in fact, that another person called Fiachra Mac Ciaran was the founder of Derry. Now, Fiachra, as it happens, was a nephew of Cholmcille. So, again, these are just subtle historical differences. What we can say with absolute certainty is that Derry, the monastery in Derry, was part of the federation of monasteries, if you like, associated with St. Columbkille. In Latin, we call that the Familia Columbae, the family of Columba. And around about the year 1200, the 12th century, beginning of the 12th century or so, Derry was, as it were, renamed as Deireadh Cholmcille, Derry of Columbkille, in honour of the saint. But that name was late from the 12th century, not there from the very beginning. There are lots and lots of other places in Ireland connected with the story of St. Columbkille. For instance, and indeed with the name Columbkille as part of them, Glen Columbkille in County Donegal, but there's a Glen Columbkille in County Clare also. Swords, beside Dublin Airport, the Sword Columbkille. Muine Columbkille is now known as Moon in County Kildare. Kells in County Meath, where the Book of Kells comes from. Drumcliff in County Sligo. And there are many, many other places, from Wexford to Donegal and from Dublin across to the Aran Islands, all connected with the story of St. Columbkille. There was, and to some extent there still is, a great respect for Columbkille in parts of Britain, especially in Scotland, of course, and especially in those parts of Scotland that where Gaelic was spoken, and in amongst the Picts, or the ancient people of eastern Scotland. And indeed, as well as that, there are places, and especially churches, archaeological sites and churches in the north of England, where the story of Columbkille is also manifest. And for instance, we could name places like the island of Lindisfarne off the Northumbrian coast, and indeed Durham Cathedral, the great cathedral Durham, were also part of the story of Columbkille and his monks, his successors. From the point of view of manuscripts, many of the most important manuscripts from early Ireland, and indeed from Britain, are also part of the Columbkille story. And you could cite, for instance, the Book of Kells, the Book of Durrow, in England, the Lindisfarne Gospels, and back in Ireland again, the Cathach. The Cathach is probably the oldest manuscript we have from Ireland, and as well as the wonderful manuscript itself, there's also what we might call the Cúdach, or in Irish, the shrine, the decorated box in which the manuscript was preserved. The oldest and possibly the most elegant of the manuscripts of the Vita Columba, the life written by Adamnan about 700, is now, of all places, in a public library in the little town of Schaffhausen in Switzerland. And that manuscript itself dates to around about 700, or maybe slightly after, 710 or thereabouts, but almost certainly around that date. And the text, but not the manuscript. The manuscript is a copy of an original. But the text of the Vita Columba was written by the man, an Old Irish Adamnan, in modern Irish, he's known as Aunan. And it was he that wrote that text, the Vita Columbae. And he was a relation, he was a later relation, because he lives about 100 years after Columba, but he was a relation of Columba. And he himself was a tremendously important person with all sorts of strings to his bow that we could talk about. But just one example of his importance is that he wrote what is now the oldest guidebook, you could call it, to the sites of the Holy Land. The book called De Locis Sanctis, in which there's a description of the great sites of the Holy Land, the sites we're familiar with around Jerusalem and Nazareth and Bethlehem and so on. And the oldest copy, the oldest text dealing with that, was written by this man, Adovnan. Now there's lots of other stories and lots of other places connected with Cholmcille in Ireland, in Scotland, in the north of England, and even onto the continent. And if you go further afield, you'll find schools, churches, hospitals, for example, dedicated to St. Cholmcille, or usually to St. Columba, in other places, such as in Africa or in America, places where either Irish people or Scottish people went as emigrants, just as Cholmcille himself had been an emigrant in the 6th century. So this is just a kind of a taste of what we know about Columba, and there's a lot more to tell. I hope you've enjoyed hearing it.